Welcome to week 2 of civics. Who gets to vote? Who has the franchise? Who has suffrage? Well, in our constitutional republic, we begin with a nod to the fact that the states created the federal government. So, each of the 13 states and the subsequent states that joined the Union have their own state laws that govern who gets to be a voter, especially in federal elections. However, Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution allows Congress to modify these laws and make sure that there is a basic federal standard for them. Now, in general terms, at the beginning of our republic, the only people who could vote were men of property of European stock who were citizens of the United States. Now, why? Well, let's go through. What is a man? A man is a male who is 21 years or older, has reached the classical age of majority of 21 years. So through most of our republic's history, you had to be 21 before you could vote. Secondly, why men? Well, while it is sort of fashionable and neat to think about equal rights as being the normal situation and anything that varies from that as being somehow abnormal, in reality, in human history, the idea of giving women the right to vote and participate is a fairly new phenomenon. Remember, before modern technology, men and women not only had very different bodies, but we had very, very different roles that were needed in order for people to survive. Men were hunters, women were gatherers in Paleolithic nomadic times. Then when we developed farming, men and women have different jobs based on, among other things, capacity to do work around the home, close to kids, close to the elderly. And that's a woman's role, whereas a man's role was more involving the sort of intense upper body strength necessary for a lot of physical labor. These roles continued into the industrial era. And it isn't really until fairly recently that starting from the top of society and percolating down, this question of whether women should have political rights begins to develop. Certainly during times like the French Revolution, there were some women who talked about it. Before that, there were women like Mary Wollstonecraft who wrote books about it. But largely, these were upper-class people before the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, the question was, how far can you push the idea of rights? Polite society and normal society was not going to take the notion of a female franchise seriously until just basically 100 years ago. In fact, it was a few months shy of 100 years ago that women were granted the right to vote in these United States. It was only a couple of years before that in Britain, and that largely a result of World War I. So, those of you who are feminists, remember something. It's a wonderful idea to want to change the future. If you want to make the future more female-friendly, go for it. That's what the political process is all about. And you now have the franchise, and once you turn 18, you can vote. But don't blame historical societies for not sharing your ideals, because that's not the way the world works. The past does not owe you an explanation. So, men were given the vote because nobody seriously thought about giving women the right to vote until very, very recently. Who are citizens? This remains a qualification of voting. You need to be a citizen in good standing of the United States. Throughout most of our history, citizens in good standing do not include felons. People who are found guilty of committing serious crimes, which are felonies, are not allowed to vote throughout most of our history and most of our states. But in recent generations, in recent decades, there have been a number of very progressive states that have decided, well, if you've paid your time, you might as well get an opportunity to vote too. So that requirement of felons losing their franchise is less and less true among the states. But Even today, in the midst of a series of debates about whether or not our borders should be closed, semi-porous, or completely open, it is still against the law in any federal election for a resident of the United States who is not a citizen of the United States to vote in the United States. There are people who want to change that, but for the moment at least, citizenship is still a requirement. Finally, who are of European stock? Now, this is in practice. It's not something that is often codified into law. It is simply true that most people would not have considered Native Americans, Indians to be part of the United States in terms of voting, and few enough of them early on wanted to vote. That changed in times and places, but early on, the assumption, and it was not reflected upon prejudice, was that this applied to men of European stock. It would apply to former slaves. Now, if a person, a man, bought his way out of slavery, achieved a form of what is called manumission, which is the emancipation from the enslaved state to a state of free citizenship, a person who would buy their freedom could vote. And often people who went north and were black did vote, if they were men and if they had their papers and that proved they were free, or if they were freeborn. And there were quite a few freeborn blacks outside of the South, more than people might think. But the oddest thing about the early stages of voting is property. You need a certain amount of property. Now, the property requirements differed from state to state. Here's why. The assumption is that if you have accrued and accumulated a certain amount of land or wealth or status, which usually comes from having land or wealth, you probably are on the ball. You are probably somebody who is able to think their way through problems, who is able to exercise their capacity for reason and be responsible. The Roman Republic, which is our example, required at first the status of patrician to participate, and then plebeian, and there were some requirements. But the Roman requirement was military service. We'll come back to that. But what the American Republic does that's different from Rome is we start out saying that we want people who have an economic stake in the society, who have property on the line as well as their own lives, and who therefore are going to make responsible decisions based on their desire for their property to continue to be worth something. The notion of getting good citizens who know their stuff is reflected in this idea that you should be a man of substance and of means who has achieved some success. And remember, in the colonial period, there was precious little inherited wealth. Most of it was achieved wealth, wealth that a person earned themselves or maybe passed on one generation to their kids, who then had to build on it more. There were very few truly amazingly wealthy people in this country when George Washington was alive. So, propertied men who are citizens and who are of European stock, and basically that means of European culture. That's who could vote at first. And it was considered a reasonable set of restrictions. Next time, we'll talk about what changes.